My understanding is that you also touched on the population issue.
Right.
Do you consider that an important issue, and what do you think ought to be done to deal with it?
Don't have children, and I'm looking at you, white men.
We're here at the COP25 in Madrid, and we are with the Oscar-winning director Michael Wadleigh of the hit documentary Woodstock, which may be the most seen documentary in all of history. Thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
So I was told by a colleague that you had a phenomenal presentation yesterday, and you talked some about Scandinavia. You know, I used to live in Scandinavia, and they really think of themselves as very green and very sustainable, but I guess there's a little bit more to the story. Could you tell us about that?
Well, what we did is that we presented for the first time in 25 years of COP the per capita emissions and consumptions of 197 nations. After all, the COP is actually a treaty, and it has 197 nation parties to it. And the idea is they're going to make an agreement for sustainable development, particularly for 1.5C and 2C global warming, right? Now that means that you really ought to bring to the table what your per capita emissions are, right? And exchange them among people and agree to reduce them basically by your responsibility. Well, now the Scandinavians don't look so good. They are very rich, and tied to all the money that they spend are emissions. Now remember, if we buy our cell phones from China, we're consuming them, and then we get the emissions. So the point is that most of the Scandinavian countries, and the USA, and Canada, and Australia, and New Zealand, they all come out on top. They are the absolute worst emitters and consumers on the planet per capita. We're used to hearing about China and India and the US as total emitters. But imagine the idea that for education, they would add up every Chinese education. He gets 8 years or 10 years education. And they would say China wins because if we total up 1.3 billion people's education, the total education is off the wall, right? Well, now we're doing that with emissions. Now that makes no sense at all. We should be ranking countries by their per capita emissions. This has never been done. Never been done. In 25 years, it's never been brought here. We brought it here first. As I say, I'm a scientist, but I also hope to be an effective communicator, and that's why your colleague enjoyed our presentation, and that's why you should come tomorrow at 1 o'clock at the Climate Action Hub. Wednesday, be there, or we go to hell, so to speak.
Interesting. And apparently in the presentation you compared the emissions per capita of like Scandinavians and Americans versus, say, Tanzanians. Can you tell us how they match up?
Pretty remarkably. So, for example, we used Scandinavia because it has such a clean image. It gives the Nobel Prizes and so forth. And indeed, then Tanzania also has a very good image. It has very low corruption and has the most amazing wildlife in the world. So if you take the average Swedish emissions, right, Tanzanians have 1/32 of those emissions. 32 times more emissions for Scandinavia than Tanzania. Therefore, the Tanzanians can increase their emissions 3% for 2C and 1% for 1.5C, whereas the Scandinavians, in this case the Swedes, have to reduce their emissions 6% for 2C and a whopping 21% for 1.5C. America, by the way, has to reduce emissions 55% per year for 1.5C. It's off the wall. But we also suggested a very good solution, and that is hashtag, how much do you love me, Mom and Dad? The idea is that in World War II, we Americans spent more than 50% of our GDP to win the war. Right now, rich countries, like in Scandinavia, who are progressive, are planning to spend less than 1% of GDP on saving the future, on measures to make sure everything's okay. 1% of GDP happens to be less than the cost of a cup of coffee per person at Starbucks per day. So it's nothing. So if we up that to about 10% of GDP, how much do you love me? Take 90% of GDP for the present and allocate 10% for the future. Scientifically, that will enable us, and that will enable Sweden and the US and so on, to make these enormous reductions in emissions and extractions. Obviously, the US will have to make up for it. They can't possibly go down 55%, but they sure as hell can give Tanzania and other countries a lot of money to plant trees and do other good works. So in the end, it will work out, but not if hashtag you don't love me, Mom and Dad, right? We got to get to that 10% GDP.
Okay, and my understanding is that you also touched on the population issue.
Right.
Do you consider that an important issue, and what do you think ought to be done to deal with it?
Don't have children, and I'm looking at you, white men. Now, what I mean by that is that, again, let's take Sweden as an example. If you take the average lifetime emissions of a Swedish baby that's going to be brought into the world, and you compare that to the average Tanzanian, which is the average African emissions, right? It is 46 to 1. Now that means if you were into population control or population reduction, which is a good idea worldwide, you should go to Sweden, because if your efforts resulted in one less baby in Sweden, that would be equal to your efforts to go to Africa and reduce populations by 46% for 46 people in Africa. 46 people reduction in Africa equals 1 person reduction in Sweden. So where does it make sense to put your population efforts in reduction? Start with the people who are the highest per capita emitters, if your goal is to reduce climate change and reduce unsustainable development. If you don't like Africans, go to Africa and reduce their population.
It seems like the bulk of the population control spending is really taking place in Africa and Asia, but you suggest it would be better spent in Europe and North America, huh?
I'm saying, what is your goal? I think we really ought to look at our goal. I think a lot of people, let's say, use it as a cover, that they say, well, we're going to Africa to reduce population, so we don't do unsustainable development and we don't do climate change. Now that is not correct if they don't reduce a huge number of Africans compared to here in America. By the way, American's greater. American, if you really eliminated 1 person in America, it's equal to approximately 50 Africans. I'm not saying we all shouldn't reduce population, but it gets a little bit racist if you then concentrate on Africans who have almost no emissions.
And what kind of tools do you think would be good for kind of bringing this about? I mean, is it just like trying to convince people through education, or maybe look more at the China model? What do you think is the best approach to doing that?
I think the best is to think about a small planet. Imagine we have a small planet that only has about 2,000 people, right? And yet we're bursting at the seams because it's really small. Well, then I think we would say to ourselves, well, wait a minute, wouldn't we all be better off if we had 1 kid or whatever? If you use an analogy where you can get a hold of the problem, and then you say, well, now what makes us all happy? How many kids do we have to have, and so on? I don't think it's a good idea to just sort of willy-nilly make laws. Of course, the great thing about laws is that everyone has to obey them, including you and me, right? So many people actually like laws. For example, imagine we go to all the school zones in the world and take away all the speed limit signs and say, okay, now you just voluntarily go through a school zone at any speed you want, 100 miles an hour or whatever. We would say that's crazy. You've got to have laws to protect our children. So circle back to this idea. Imagine we have a small world. Think about then what makes people happy. And as Mark Zuckerberg will tell you, it's very hard to sell products to people because he's got Facebook going there, and what people want is other people and activities in nature. And he has to take their love for people and then segue it over onto products. Now think about, well, we want babies. We want to be happy and have our children and go on and so forth. Well, do we really need to have lots of babies? Or if we thought about a small world and now we only have so many resources, would we then bring a bunch of babies in who are going to have a hell of a horrible life, for all of them, not just one of them, but all of them, right?
I have to ask you, do you have kids?
Only one.
Only one? Okay,
Yeah,
so that's sustainable.
Listen to this. My grandfather was one, my father was one, I'm an only child, and my daughter's one. So we've been following what we preach. But remember, I have to emphasize, your colleague probably heard, our biggest problem is products. Our biggest problem is that we all have equated our identities with all of our stuff. And Tanzanians see it on their cell phones and in the movies. They all want to be like us. So we've got to de-escalate this idea that we are our stuff. We've got to be happy with what we have. We've got to take out our own individuality with our own talents and with social gregariousness and so on. A good model is a spaceship. If you go up there into the International Space Station, they have very few products. They have one guitar up there that everyone plays, right? They all wear the same outfits. But my God, they have this whole intellectual and creative expressiveness that they can do up there. So they really don't feel deprived. I mean, up there, a bottle of water costs $250 to get out there. So they really appreciate the water. But they don't really feel deprived. And I think if we just shifted our attitude toward Homo sapiens. Again, I'm a doctor. I know what I'm talking about, that we're a 300,000-year-old species, and on that level, on 300,000 years, right, we don't need all this junk. We are really programmed to find safety in each other, in our activities, and in nature. After all, we're all made out of nature, and even primitive man realized that. So that's the message, I think.
How low do you think it should go? Because I mean, it was actually just in the news yesterday that America has a falling birth rate that's actually not replacement levels. Brazil now the same thing. So I think a lot of the Western countries at least are moving in that direction. Do you think it's fast enough? Do we need to accelerate that? And is there a limit at which point we say, okay, we've reduced enough now, maybe we can equalize again, maybe 2.1 babies per family? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, hang on to this. The International Resource Panel, with whom we work very closely, that's the UN panel that is the expert on natural resource extractions. Here's the point. In all these countries that have falling rates of reproduction, including the US, they are tiny, tiny rates of falling. They're really minuscule, right? And in fact, the amount of consumption that's increasing, right, outweighs the number of people that are falling off. So if you take the total stuff that the USA is ripping out of the ground, including what they're importing from China, and gobbling up in terms of consumption, that consumption is going up every year at a greater rate than the population is going down. Do you see what I mean? That this is crazy time, right? We're not getting anywhere by reducing population. If we're on this small spaceship, imagine it's a spaceship called the United States of America. Well then, for Christ's sake, we're still eroding our resource base that can support the population. So I don't think it's an absolute number, but we must realize when you say decline, look at the number. It's generally 0 point something or other. It's not even 1% that it's declining. And then if you look at the fantastic rates of consumption that are higher in the United States compared even to China and India and Africa and South America, they're fantastically high. So that therefore, if you put together the consumption and then the population, you say, wow, this is ridiculous. The USA is going off the chart, right?
I'm sure you've heard of Paul Ehrlich and John Hall. Did you ever read Eco-Science in 1977?
Oh, of course.
Okay.
Now, I'm an old man, you remember.
I
So
see you're a
I
little
know,
older than me.
I know these people personally.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah, well, Woodstock was so famous that I got to meet everyone. And it was very influential, of course, because the point of the festival, I'm sure you don't know, but in 1901 in Woodstock, New York, the American Communist and Socialist parties were founded. In 1901, right? So it was the home of socialism. It was the home of alternative parties in America, the left-wing parties. And then Woody Guthrie came there in the 20s, right? So he added music to the mix. And then in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote her famous book, Silent Spring, and she came there. And then Buckminster Fuller came there with his geodesic domes and so on, and his concept of spaceship Earth, right? So that there was a whole cauldron, so to speak, that was bubbling around Woodstock. And in 1969, the festival took place, and the festival's logo was a dove, nature, sitting on a guitar, music. And the whole idea was to go to a farm. It was held on Yasgur's farm. There was no consumption. Almost nothing was for sale. So that was the idea, to get back to the garden. If you listen to the lyrics of the Woodstock song, we're caught in the devil's bargain, right? We're consuming, destroying the earth. And we've got to get back to the garden, meaning we have to get sustainable and stop destroying nature. Those were all the themes that are in there. Going Up Country was an anthem. I got to get out of the city, got to get away, all this fussing and fighting, I can't stay. Go into the country where the water tastes like wine, got to jump right in, stay drunk all the time. If you really listen to the lyrics, you'll understand that the real environmental movement began in the 60s, and here we are 50 years later, and the first Earth Day had tens of millions of people on the street. I mean, way more than are on the streets today. And here we are 50 years later, and the emissions just keep going up, and the consumption keeps going up.
The reason I asked about Paul Ehrlich is because I know he got some criticism for some of the things that were proposed in that book, planetary regime, forced abortions, adding sterilizing agents in the water supply. Do you think that goes too far? Or is it, I was going to say, is the crisis serious enough that where we need to start thinking of those kinds of really serious solutions? Or do we have time? Or
Again, I don't see it as a scientist that population is our problem. Consumption is our problem. It really, really is. And if you look at the figures, I think you'll believe it. I hope you can come to my presentation.
I definitely will be there.
Because that's really what we ought to think about. How much junk do we need per person, really? And think about it like a spaceship, that we only have so much. We're not, well, for example, Elon Musk keeps saying we're going to go out there and mine these asteroids. I suppose you know that right now the Japanese have a hovering craft above an asteroid, and they're going to bring back 2 kilograms to add to the 385 kilograms that we brought back from the moon 50 years ago. 2 kilograms. Guess how much they're going to cost? $2 million. $1 million per kilogram. Now, it's fanciful to imagine. We are currently taking out of the Earth worldwide 97 trillion kilograms. Now imagine we're going to pay $1 billion for each kilogram to import. It's not going to happen. Therefore, more than population, it's really the natural resources that we have, out of which everything is made, including you and me, right? So we've got to look at that, and then we've got to think about our population. But again, I don't think we should lose track of this perspective. Whose population should we be reducing? If consumption is the problem, then we shouldn't go to the low consumers and put all of our attention, say, don't repeat the lessons that we've blown, and all that sort of thing. Look at how much they're emitting, look at how much they're consuming, and do it rationally. And then look at ourselves, and then say to yourself, well, am I better off, and is the world better off, and the United States better off if I only have one baby? Otherwise, if everybody has all these babies, how the hell are we going to feed them? Because already you heard the scientists here putting out the warnings of food and fresh water. And those 2 things keep us alive. And everyone is terrified that there will be billions of starving people. And no matter how big our military, we're not going to be able to stop them.
But there's another conundrum with this that I can think of, because I know really religious people, especially in the United States, really hardcore Christians, and also a lot in the Islamic world, they tend to think of having babies as like, almost a command by God. So if all the progressives only have, 1 baby per family or whatever, and all the religious people have 10, 12 babies, couldn't that lead to a problem? How do we address that?
Yeah, you're right, it leads to a problem. I think it's up to us as communicators, as clever communicators, to communicate to them. And again, I think we have to put it in perspective. We've got to really look at who's having a lot of babies. And then I think you're right. Then figure out your message, figure out the clever message. Things go better with Coca-Cola. Look at the Coca, no, really, look at Islam. Look how modernized Islamic people are, right? They really are not that different than you and me. Mm-hmm. So then modernize their reproduction. Really, it's as simple as that. Say, now what is going to make you happy, and tailor the messages to them. Because I really think that deep down, my understanding of science, and I think it's absolutely right, is that Homo sapiens are really unmodified. Our genetics have not undergone a great change for 300,000 years. We're sitting here not really needing all these products and really not needing all these babies. Give you the example of the sand bushmen, right? Very famous, and very studied. They realized that their environment didn't support large populations, and they moderated their population. And you can see that all over the world. The populations that exploded were because resources were abundant, and then they exploded and hit the resources. But if you look at the primitive populations, when they realized, wow, we got it, they automatically, and they made a deal among themselves. We simply can't reproduce like this. We can't. Look at the anthropology, you'll see that I'm right. So now if we're able to convey that message to subgroups of population that are overdoing it, I think they will go down. I really do. Because they'll realize we don't need all these babies to be happy. We don't need it.
Interesting, very fascinating. So, one more question. You got to ask about the elephant in the room here. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
So, the elephant in the room, and it was the same in Poland last year. We were there with our team, is Donald Trump. You know, he says that the man-made global warming hypothesis is a hoax to benefit the communist Chinese, and that CO2 is not pollution. What do you do about something like that?
I guess as a very left-wing person, I'm far more worried about Obama, and I'm far more worried about Bernie Sanders.
Really?
Yeah, because this whole "we're still in" movement, if they're still in for what Obama was offering, America is going to cut their emissions about 10% of what they should. It's 10 times less than what they should. Obama did not offer a cut that reflects what America is doing per capita. And unfortunately or fortunately, the Chinese are not stupid. They have their own scientists. They know very well what per capita emissions are. The Indians are not stupid. They have excellent scientists. And even the Tanzanians have world-class scientists. So even if the politicians adapt a certain attitude, it's not going to change physical reality. These people will know and tell their politicians what the situation is. As I say, we could think about, now let's assume that the Democrats get in power. Now what are they going to do? If they're going to do "we're still in," that will be 1/10 of what America's responsible for. Bernie's a good guy. Unfortunately, and think about this for a moment, Bernie and Alexandra are really concentrating on the present. They really don't like the inequalities in the present. In their economics, they have not allocated 10% to the future and 90% to the present. They really haven't. In what they want to do is to clean up inequality in America and, of course, do some things with climate and so on. But what we would like to see them do is to say, hey, how much do you love the future, right? Let's give 90% to cleaning up Black Lives Matter and all that sort of thing, and women's rights and so on, and give 10% to the future. By the way, again, Bernie and Alexandra's general point about gender equality is that women get more money up to the level of men, meaning they consume more up to the level of men. Why the hell not bring men down to the level of women, right? I mean, you see what I'm saying? Because consumption is our big problem, right? So let's have equality, but bring down the consumption for everybody, equitably, right?